So the hardest part was Christmas, she said, because he said, you know, that there just wasn't a Christmas, and she remembered those years when she was a little girl and they just really had nothing, and that her mother actually went out and got a tumbleweed and made a Christmas tree out of it because they were so poor. So it was tough, no question. It was very, very tough. But the farm families stuck together, and of course that made it possible for them to endure the conditions until things got better.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you think things have changed in the world since Kennedy was shot? So it's kind of modern time.
Yeah. Kennedy, of course, was shot in 1963. Okay. So between the time Eisenhower was, right after the war, after World War II, Eisenhower became the president. And then the country began to develop economically quickly because we had the beginnings of the space program. And socially, you know, the country was also growing because we had, you know, we still had a divided country in some ways, because America was divided. The South was its own world. It had its kind of, you know, it had its own laws almost, and it was a separate political entity. The East Coast was the industrial part of the world, because during World War II, places like Detroit and all through Michigan, wherever there was manufacturing through what they call the Iron Belt, the Rust Belt, Ohio and across up into Pennsylvania, there was a huge amount of heavy construction. We had an industrial economy left over from World War II, because in World War II we were building tanks, and we were building trucks, and we were building airplanes, and all those kinds of things. So right after the war, there was a slump, because it took a while, and these informants have talked to me about, like in 1948 or 49, still 4 years after the war, they still couldn't buy a truck, because it took so long to convert those plants from building tanks to building farm trucks, that there was still a huge shortage of those kinds of machines. So there was a slump that happened in the economy. And then things began to take off again. And so by the time Kennedy was president, okay, we had a very flourishing economy. We learned from the soldiers who came back from the war, from World War II, we created a thing called the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was money set aside. If you'd been in the military, this was the country's idea that you should then now go get a formal education. Because a lot of people, and that, you know, a lot of people in this part of the world gave up their formal education because they were just maybe in their last year of high school, and they were off to the war, and some were gone 4 years. So the government said, hey, you know, these guys missed out. So they said, okay, we're going to provide money so that anybody who'd been in the military who wanted to go on to a further education could have it. So we changed this was an important part of changing the thinking about what is the source of real wealth in the country. Before, it had to do with land, it had to do with industrial production. But then as a country we realized, well, now what really counts probably is the ability to educate the population, and then utilize that education to create industries that are different. And so that's where, you know, Kennedy said, okay, we're going to the moon. Right? That was his pledge. And sure enough, we did that. We were able to get to the moon in 1969. And so that was an exciting time, because we went from, especially where I lived, because I grew up and you know, I spent my winters and summers in the farm. I spent my time all summer. You know, other kids, you know, the town kids, they went off to camp or something. We didn't. We went out to stack hay or, you know, change water, do all those kinds of things that you did as a farm kid. But as sort of the 1960, 61, 62, things began to change. But I remember too, when I was in junior high school, which would have been 61, I think, we had drills. We had air raid drills. But we were all aware, it was just through the atmosphere, that we were at war with Russia. We knew that that Russia was a huge threat to our country, okay? And it was everywhere, because everywhere you would drive, you don't see this ever anymore. You would see these signs that would tell you that this was a shelter, and it was a bomb shelter. So people, the schools, and the colleges, and every other municipal building designated part of their basement as a bomb shelter. So when we were kids, we had drills, and what we would do in junior high, I well remember that the whole school, it was like a fire drill, but what you would do is the whole school they would announce on the PA system that this was the civil defense drill. So everybody was expected to go down and converge in this basement. And the plan was you're going to stay there. Because if we were attacked by missiles from Russia, and the radioactivity was everywhere. And we all got used to knowing about radioactivity, how much radioactivity, how long was it going to be before you could actually go outside again. And it was a terrifying time, especially if you're a little kid, because these are pretty big things. And on television, of course, was always the constant thing about bombs being tested. We had bombs being tested in the atmosphere. Atomic bombs were tested all over the South Pacific. And then later on, they signed an agreement where they would just test them underground. Okay. But in the time leading up to what was called the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a very nervous time. But it was also a very exhilarating time because, as I said, the educational process, the educational machine was beginning to run. And so we had access, the school I went to what's called the lab school in Greeley, which is part of the college. So it was like the best charter school ever. I mean, we had a main teacher, and then we had 4 student teachers in every room. I mean, we were saturated in teachers. And so, to be a high school or a junior high school kid and being on campus and all of that, it was, we thought that was very cool. So, but all of the others, it was also in the beginning of the time when schools were beginning to divide between the academic pursuits and some of the trade schools, because in the early 60s, they also said, we've got to have, not only do we have to have people who can do math and science, we also have people who can build things, high-tech things. So Ames College, for example, the beginnings of that were there, where you could get a really good technical education. And unlike other countries, because I've been in England, and you find there that it's a class system, where the academic people are considered to be, more sophisticated and more, in some sense, more valuable than the trade people. I mean, there's been a class structure in many other countries, but we didn't really have that here so much. You were encouraged, if you want to go to trade school, great, go and learn something and get a job. And that was a big emphasis, that it wasn't how smart you could be, but how smart could you get to get a good job. And now, very few people went just for the academics. It was designed to take you there so that you could earn a lot more money. And so this college, for example, ramped up because the need for agricultural development. We had to make agriculture better. So that's what this college was founded on. It was the ability to improve agriculture and horticulture and animal science. And of course now it's much more diverse. I mean, it's not just a cow college anymore. This college has a lot to offer in many other disciplines. But that's why it was, you know, it was a land-grant college, it was here for that purpose. But as we got closer to the time Kennedy got killed, you know, many of the underlying social issues began to come to the front. So I remember television, and we got our first television in 1954. Television didn't exist in Colorado until, I think, 1951, perhaps. And that was only broadcast in Denver, a little section of Denver. And then it was KRMA Channel 6 was the first television channel that could reach us as far north as Greeley. And it was on for 4 or 5 hours a day. And then by the time I was, I don't know, by the time Mickey Mouse Club came along and things that I loved, there were 3 channels. And then it stayed that way for many, many years. And then at the same time that we were, you know, we were developing an economy and a view of how the world was going to be when as we thought about it as high-tech. Missiles were high-tech to us. I mean, that was high-tech. That's what it was. And military radars and the whole idea of satellites and all that sort of thing coming along was leading the imagination of the country. So Kennedy had posed all these objectives. You know, he wanted everybody to he had to create a volunteer program. You could go, it was kind of like the early Vista and other kinds of things where you would go and volunteer in your community. He set the agenda for the space program. He set the agenda for nuclear power, because that was another thing. He said, well, you know, we need more power. Okay, well, nuclear might be the way to go. And so all those things were manifest in the Kennedy administration. It was the symbol, and it was also the mechanism that was going on in the country for getting all this stuff done. And so people were very enthused. One of the issues was that we had religious issues. Kennedy was a Catholic, and of course there was bias both ways, you know. But we weren't a global nation, and that's the big difference now that I see. The biggest difference now is that we are so linked in all the states. Before, when I was a kid, it was like those were regions and far off places, you know. And so now it's, in my mind, almost transparent that we are linked, you know, we've linked ourselves as a nation. And now, you know, as we have the global economy and the ability to communicate across the world, you know, at least as a country, we have eliminated a lot of the sort of bias that we've had about other parts of the country. You know, there was, you know, here we are in Colorado, we're in the West. Well, we were always better than the East for this reason or that reason. And of course, the East always thought everybody out here was a hick, and, you know, this was a primitive part of the world no matter what. So those kinds of prejudice and sort of insular thinking have pretty much gone away, in my view. So it has changed. But when Kennedy was killed, it was, as I say, a national shock. Everybody loved you know, Mrs. Kennedy and the kids and all of that. Felt sorry for them. Kennedy did represent, though, Kennedy represented integration. And of course there was a fairly sizable resistance to that in those times. And then when Johnson took over as president, he had to deal with that. You know, had Kennedy lived, you know, you could speculate endlessly as to what would be different if Kennedy had lived. Probably much of what happened was going to happen anyway. You know, we were going to see integration. We were going to see the country dealing with the Russian threat, which Johnson had to. The expansion of communism in Asia, and then throughout the Russian side. I mean, all those issues which you probably haven't been exposed to at all, But there was a lot of global tension at that point. And it was just like fear, you know, I think about this in comparison to fear of World War II. Because a lot of the informants we've talked to, especially some who had a family that lived on either coast, there was a real concern that there was going to be an invasion, that the United States would have foreign troops who would attack San Francisco, they would come in through Mexico, they would come over the border in Canada. I mean, this was a real concern that, you know, it would have been possible to lose the war. We could have been taken over by somebody else. So that built up a lot of you know, that did draw people together dramatically. And so Kennedy's death also drew people together in a sort of dramatic fashion, because it was kind of like, you know, it's kind of like 9/11 in a sense, that it was a kind of terrorism, because it was so odd, so unexpected. No president, I mean, there had been other presidents who'd been killed, but nobody really remembered anybody since Lincoln. And we thought, well, this will never happen here. And so when Kennedy was killed, it was a dramatic cultural event. It was a shocking event, and it took a lot. You know, we never really got over it as a country that this should begin to happen here. And now you're beginning to live through the post 9/11 world, and so, you know, that has been as much of a shock in its own context as what's Kennedy. You know, who knows what's ahead? We don't know, but certainly, the point I was going to make about fear, though, was in World War II, there was a real fear that we would be taken over. We would lose the war to the Germans or the Japanese or the Axis, or however it turned out to be. And then in the late parts of the 50s, when I was in grade school, and there was a real fear, I mean, a day in, day out fear, that there would be a nuclear war. And the consequences of that were, you know, it didn't take long for television to pick up on that and say, okay, well, if we have a nuclear war, nobody's left. You know, there will be nothing. You know, they talk about a concept called nuclear winter. I don't know if you've encountered that, but nuclear winter is you blow up enough soil and dirt, and it goes up into the atmosphere, and it darkens the atmosphere for so long that nothing will grow. It would end kind of like you know, the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago by a meteorite. Same concept. We would have ended up with the same kind of event. So people were scared, and of course that's why people like Kennedy represented the point where we could all focus and say, okay, you know, we got problems, but we got people who are smart, who we can trust, who will deal with this problem, and we will prevail. And so that was a very, very important point in history, that when we lost Kennedy, we still had the Russian threat. So now what do? Well, then the thinking of the country got radically distracted, because we began conflict in Asia, and so then we still had the Russians with missiles, and now we've got, you know, a ground war, and we've got, you know, other problems that go along with that. So it was a truly monumental time post Kennedy, because there was a lot of conflict that had to be resolved. Kennedy probably could have held it all in check to some degree, but when he was killed, things went wide open. Okay, what else?
I had a question. It's not really on the page, but
No.
during the Vietnam War, Philly was known to be a very clean, safe environment.
Right.
And with the Vietnam pictures on the television, do you think that had an impact on really to change them from being so moral and so safe to
The only time let me just give you a kind of cultural parallel. The last election, when there was absolute polarity in this country over issues and who represented what was to be right, okay? Well, when Vietnam came along, it polarized the country to an equal magnitude, you know? But it went on for years. I mean, the election just went on for a year or so. But the Vietnam conflict went on for many years, from 65 until 73. So we were living in that divisive angst that went on with that war. And, you know, there were lots of, you know, it became very much talking head because it became personalities. Okay, here's Johnson. Right? Johnson represented the sort of hawkish side, but then the Hawks really thought Johnson was too weak because he wouldn't actually go and finish the war. Okay? We had people like General Westmoreland, who you probably never heard of, but he was the one who was in charge of the Air Force during Vietnam, and he once said, and this line, of course, tagged him forever. He said, "We'll solve it. We'll just bomb them back to the Stone Age." And of course, that created a great polarity, because there was a huge anti-war movement that developed, as well as there was a support the troops movement, just, you know, similar to what you're hearing now. And so the Congress, of course, was in the middle of this thing, and, you know, like as usual, fails to act in some way or other, or try to avoid the issue. And consequently, the public, on an individual basis, became very polarized. There were people who were solidly for the war, there were people who were solidly against the war in Vietnam. And so that was a conversation, constant conversation. We got so focused on that. It's kind of like the Iraq War now, you know, we focused so tightly on that it became almost an obsession. And so when Vietnam finally was over, you know, those still in movies are still made about, you know, what impact it had not only on the soldiers who were there and all their families and everybody who was directly or indirectly involved in the Vietnam War, but it was such a divisive time, and then you have overlays, because you had, okay, so here we are with our army, and we're going to, you know, we're at war with, you know, with North Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and ultimately China, because China was enabling, it was supporting the North because they were making money off it. So there was this lineup of countries who were our enemies, and then there were the lineup, kind of the same way as Iraq now, because we had Australia sent troops to Vietnam. France fought the war in Vietnam 10 years before that. France had gone in to try to colonize Southeast Asia and didn't do a very good job of it. So they ended up being thrown out. And so when the U.S. went in, it was the same thing. We were a coalition. You know, it's not just the U.S. versus South and North Vietnam. It was Australia, England, and half a dozen other countries. And the same thing, after a time, some of these countries backed out because they had their own domestic politics that made it really difficult for them to continue. So, but it was, the Vietnam time was very divisive because, as I was about to tell you, the other issues got linked to the war, because we then said, one of the cries was, okay, we're only principally drafting black men into the army, because if you were a white male, you could get a school deferment, whereas if you were a black guy not in school, the draft would come and get you, and there was a draft. So during the time of all through the Vietnam War, there was draft, And so when I was in college, in the first couple of years, there was a draft resistance office in the college. Inside the college, there was an office you could go to, and they would walk you through the process of staying out of the draft. And that was very popular, of course, because, you know, very few people actually wanted to be, you know, to be drafted. There were lots of volunteers, though. There were many, many volunteers to the Vietnam War. There were plenty of people who signed up to go and be in the military. So they didn't really have a recruiting shortage at the beginning. But then they needed so many troops, they said, okay, now we have to have a draft. And the draft had already been in place since the war anyway, so they just brought it back and revved it up, and so that there would be enough guys to go to war. At one time, you know, we had 500,000 soldiers engaged in the Vietnam War, because it took 10 guys, for every guy that was on the front line, it took 10 guys to support him. Okay? And that's where, you know, the beginnings, there were some TV shows about the beginnings of women in the military. And so that Vietnam was a place where there were a lot of women who came into non-traditional military jobs, because they needed a huge nursing and convalescent operation, and they would do that. They had aircraft carriers off the coast of Vietnam that if you got injured, you would be flown by helicopter out to a hospital ship, and that was how they had to do it, because there was such a volume of people who got hurt. But here, the notion was, or one of the controversies was, well, okay, now it's just the black population that's being taken off to war. So there were claims of racism, and said, okay, we're now, we have to deal with that. So that's where the rioting came from in the 60s. And we had some severe rioting in the latter part of the 1960s. There were neighborhoods, black neighborhoods in particular, that were burnt down. And this, of course, from the outside never made sense, because if the black population was protesting their treatment, and they ended up burning down their own neighborhoods. And and that had happened, a place called Watts. I don't know if you've heard about Watts in California, but Watts is a suburb of LA. Okay, it was the Watts riot of 1968.